Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be taking you step by step through my entire painting process for this watercolor pencil sunflower. For this one, I wanted to explore color a little bit more and use color in a bit of a bolder way. And so what I did was I made use of one of the tried and true color schemes based on the color wheel that have been used by artists throughout history. Learning about color theory and the color wheel is essential for artists because it not only allows us to know exactly which colors we need to reach for throughout the painting process so that we can successfully create our different color mixtures and blend colors together, but we're also able to more effectively choose our color schemes or color palettes that we're going to be using for a new piece, which is essential because color is an element of art that plays a huge role in making a visual composition look harmonious and cohesive. And randomly picking colors throughout the painting process is a surefire way of arriving at colors that you don't want or even muddiness. And so this is why I'm a huge proponent of always making time to pre-select the colors that you're going to be using before getting started. I'd highly recommend learning about these different color schemes and also exploring them for yourself. It can really help you get to know color more deeply and also come up with new ideas to use color in different ways in your artwork. So I'm not going to be going into all of these today, but the basic color schemes that I would highly recommend learning about are the monochromatic color scheme, the analogous color scheme, the complementary color scheme, the split complementary, the triad, the tetrad, and the square. And for this study today, I chose to go with the square color scheme. So I'm going to be sharing exactly how I did this, how I chose my colors based on this color scheme and the color wheel, as well as what I did with my reference photo or how I prepared it in order to facilitate the process for myself for arriving at effective and unique results. All right, so without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight in. So here is my preliminary outline sketch that I have created using an HB pencil, and I've already prepared it on my watercolor sheet. This is a cold press 140-pound watercolor sheet that I have taped onto my black cutting mat using regular masking tape. All right, so here is this beautiful sunflower reference photo that I found over at pexels.com. This one was taken by photographer Vadim Bokharov. I opened it up in Photoshop. I did a little bit of cropping, and I also desaturated the photo or turned it into a grayscale or black and white photo. And the reason why I'm using a black and white photo for this one is because I am not choosing my colors necessarily based on what I am seeing in the photo, but instead I am choosing my colors based on that square color scheme that I was talking about before. It may be the case that one or two colors present in my color scheme are similar to a couple of colors present in the photo, and I may choose to use them in those same locations. But other colors I'm probably going to change. I don't want the colors present in the photo to inform my decisions in terms of where I use my different colors. This I know is going to help me use color in a different way from what I would usually do and not be influenced by the photo so that I can use my color in a bolder, more expressive way. This said, I am going to be using the reference photo in order to develop my different values throughout the piece. My lights, my midtones, my dark areas. This is very important because I am going for a certain level of realism, 3D-ness, depth, and a believable light and shadow effect. All right, so with my reference photo prepared and with my color scheme selected, I am now going to be choosing the specific group of colors that I'm going to be using for this piece. So a square color scheme is made up of 4 different colors. These 4 colors are all equally separated by 2 colors in between. If you were to draw lines connecting these 4 colors together, you would create a perfect square in the color wheel. And just like with all of the other color schemes, you can go all around the color wheel. Wherever you're able to create this square, those 4 colors that you connect create a square color scheme. So for this one, because sunflowers have yellow-orange petals, and I do want to kind of respect that important characteristic of this type of flower, and this is just an artistic choice that I made, I decide to go with yellow-orange, red, blue-violet, and green as my square color scheme. So all I did was I reached out for my watercolor pencil set and I chose these 4 colors that were most similar to these 4 colors in my color wheel. I also decided to bring in an extra neutral. This is kind of a raw sienna or a light brown that I am bringing in. And this is important to mention as well. You can feel free to bring in neutral colors, browns, black, white, or even use these different colors in your color scheme in a variety of different tints, tones, and shades. And it's still going to be the square color scheme or the triad color scheme or the tetrad or the split complementary or whatever the case may be. For this one though, I really wanted to push myself to keep my number of colors limited to the bare minimum amount that I felt I needed. Don't be afraid to bring in an extra color or 2 aside from the ones that you prepare for your color scheme, but just make mindful use of them. Make sure you know why you're bringing in that extra color or 2. Is it to deepen and darken certain areas? If you don't really need it, don't bring it in, because remember, the point of using these color schemes is to create a nice color harmony in our piece. And if you randomly bring in colors, this will lead to an incohesive look at the end. And the more limited the amount of colors or the more thought out they are, the more, as you can see later, I repeat my colors throughout the different areas in my piece, the greater the harmony, the more integrated everything is going to look. All right, so just before jumping in, as always, I took a quick second to swatch out my different colors that I chose on my scrap piece of watercolor paper. And I also activated these colors with a paintbrush and a little bit of water because I will be doing some color activation a couple of times throughout this process. And watercolor pencils can definitely surprise you when you activate them. So I wanted to make sure I knew what they would look like when I activated them just to avoid any unnecessary surprises. So the 5 colors that I went with here are from my Faber-Castell Gold Faber Aqua watercolor pencil set. And these colors are dark chrome yellow, burnt ochre, pale geranium lake, blue violet, and permanent green olive. And here, the final thing I'm going to be doing before getting started with my coloring or painting process is I am taking a quick second to tap my kneaded eraser over my sketch to lighten it a little bit more because I don't want my pencil work to be super visible at the end. An excess of graphite on your watercolor sheet can also muddy up your vibrant colors if you're not careful. All right, so this is what I would refer to as the first part of this painting process, phase number 1. So what I do in this phase is I start with the first layering of colors all throughout the piece, focusing on value. I always get started with the lightest color that I'm going to be using in that shape or area first, and I make my way towards the darker colors. So in this case, I'm getting started with the petals, and this is the lightest color that I'm going to be using in the petals, which is my dark chrome yellow. As I am doing this, I am constantly looking at that reference photo, and I am noticing roughly where the lightest value areas are or where the highlight areas are, where I want to leave a bit of that whiteness and brightness of that paper shining through. I don't want to go in and completely cover up these petal shapes with a flat layer of color all throughout. I do what I usually do when I'm working with traditional watercolor paint and incorporate that whiteness and brightness of the paper under the pigment. And I do my best to have that whiteness of that paper stand in place for my highlight areas. And there is no need to be super precise about getting everything exactly the way it is in that photo. I'm just getting ideas for where major highlight areas are and trying to get in those abstract irregular shapes for my highlight areas approximately in the size and shape and location that I see in that reference photo. But I don't stress about it too much or take too long in any single area. All right, so that's my first layer done with the yellow, and I am now switching on over to my burnt ochre, which is the darker color that I'm going to be using in the petal shapes in this initial phase. So with this burnt ochre, what I am doing is I am focusing on deepening and darkening only the very darkest value areas that I see in the petals, and allowing the previous lighter color and the highlights to be left alone, shining through. Meaning I am only layering this burnt ochre in sections that I am looking to darken further, and I am leaving the previous lighter colors alone in areas of lighter values. I'm doing my best to work around and keep those brightest highlight areas protected as I am moving forward, just like what I would do when I am using traditional watercolor paint. When I am working with traditional watercolor paint or watercolor pencils, I don't ever bring in white paint or a white watercolor pencil even, because I always look for ways to incorporate that whiteness of the paper and use the medium's translucency to my advantage to develop those highlights in lighter value areas. In order for something to look semi-realistic, value, lights, midtones, and darks is really number one, and is even more important than color correctness. So whenever you're looking to create mid to higher levels of realism, you need to focus on value. What is going on in that reference photo? What is going on in terms of light and shadow with that thing that you have in front of you in real life? Notice lightest areas, notice midtone areas, notice darkest dark areas, and make those happen throughout your piece. As long as you have the values developed correctly, effectively, your colors don't necessarily have to be exactly the same. You'll be able to achieve a level of realism in your piece, a level of depth and 3D-ness and light and shadow. But you do have to learn about light behavior and pay attention to what is happening in terms of values in your reference photo or whatever it is that you have in front of you in real life. And choosing the right reference photo that isn't over or underexposed, where you're able to see lights, midtones, and darks is also incredibly important. Because if you're not working with a good reference photo, that is going to make the process even harder for you. If you can't see those different values, how are you going to make them happen in your drawing or painting? All right, so I'm now working in the central section of the flower, and I am using the exact same two colors for this initial layering that I was using for the petals. I first went in with my yellow, and I just avoided coloring in the highlight sections. And then once my initial lightest color was in, I switched on over to my burnt ochre, and I only layered this color in sections that I wanted to deepen and darken. There is this ring, if you will, this section that looks raised in that central section of the flower. And in that section, I did go in with a little bit more of a scribbling motion instead of a back and forth motion with my pencil. And the reason why I used more of a scribbling motion is because I knew that that kind of stroke with my pencil would allow me to better describe that texture that is going on in that central section of the flower. It's always helpful to think of different ways that you can use your drawing tools in order to better communicate or describe different textures simultaneously to your value and color development. One same drawing or painting tool can be used in so many different ways in order for us to arrive at the effects that we're looking for. All right, so I'm all done with the upper portion of the flower, and I am now working on the stem and the leaves. So I decided to go in initially with my yellow. So as you can see, I am creating that entire initial layer with my yellow. And then my second color that I'm going to be using to push darker values with is my green. So I am constantly looking at that reference photo, noticing where darkest value areas are throughout the stem and the leaves. And I'm just loosely jumping from section to section and layering this green on top of the yellow in these darkest areas. You're going to notice that I leave little sections where the yellow is left shining through, uncovered with this green. All right, so I'm all done with the leaves and the stem, and it is now time to move on to the very last part of this piece, which I haven't added any color in yet, which is the bottle. So for this initial layering of color, I am using purple and I am using red, which are the other two colors for this color scheme that I haven't used yet. For the bottle, I do things slightly differently though, because purple is darker than red, and so I do apply the purple first in this case and then the red. And this is because I wanted my bottle to look purple and have just a little bit of a hint of red reflections on it, as opposed to the other way around. However, I do the same thing in which I work around those brightest highlight areas. My intention here is to leave the highlights throughout the bottle free of any color, and to also have certain areas with a very small amount of pigment in them, which are going to be lighter value areas. And throughout this entire painting process, that is the main idea. I'm doing the majority of that layering, the heaviest placement and layering of color in darkest value areas, and lightest value areas have little to no color in them. This said, even in darkest value areas that I know I want to be super dark at the end, I am taking it forward incrementally, a step at a time. I am not looking to burnish my paper at this point or press down too hard. I want to be patient and work in layers. All right, so I'm all done with phase number 1 of this process. You just saw me add in little pops of red here and there throughout the bottle. And with this initial layering done, it was time to move on to phase number 2 of this process, which is going to be our first activation of color. So I'm going to be using a size 6 round brush for my activation of color. And you can see how I have a container with clean water to my left. And I also have my absorbent towel to my right. My absorbent towel is going to help me stay on top of water control, and it's going to help me not go in with too much water. We really don't need very much water at all in our paintbrush bristles to do activation of color when we're working with watercolor pencils. A little bit goes a long way, and you don't want to bring out a ton of water or start dripping water all over the place. Notice how I am constantly dabbing the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel in order to ensure that I'm not going in with too much. So as I am activating my color, I am still trying to keep my highlight brightest areas protected throughout these petals. And something that is helpful is to work in the lightest section of the petal towards the darkest section of the petal. Why? Because if you work in the darkest section of the petal first, what you have to remember is that that pigment is going to start getting collected in your paintbrush bristles, and you're going to start pulling that darkest color into lighter value areas, covering up that lighter value and darkening that area. And then what happens is that you get rid of your lightest values. We don't want to do that. You want to always, whether you're applying your pigment with a watercolor pencil or whether you're working on your color activation, you want to have value in mind. So as you're activating all of these different areas, make sure that you're continuing to observe that reference photo and that you continue noticing where you've already started developing the lightest sections, the mid-tone sections, and the darkest sections. And make sure that along the way, you are removing that color from your paintbrush bristles whenever you see you have collected way too much pigment in them and you're starting to pull way too much pigment into lighter value sections or sections of different colors where you don't want that color. Continue removing that color from your paintbrush bristles as you go, as needed. You need to continue paying attention to how you're pushing and pulling that color around. And with this, phase number 2 of this process is done. So I'm going to allow everything to dry completely. Feel free to help yourself with a hair dryer if you want to speed up that drying process. But make sure that everything is 100% completely bone dry before you get started with the next phase of this process. All right, so with everything completely dry, I'm getting started with phase number 3. The objective of this phase is to simply deepen and darken darkest value sections all throughout this piece by doing a little bit more layering. So you're gonna see me use the darker color of the pear that I was using before for each of these areas. The color that I have in my hand right now is my burnt ochre. I went right in with this burnt ochre, and as you can see, I am focusing on only pushing the shadow shapes in these petals. I am looking at that photo and noticing how different petals overlap on top of each other, creating shadows on each other. And I'm also thinking of the structure of the petal itself, where it makes sense that those sections wouldn't be catching light, where it's going into that central section of the flower and perhaps those little sections are not catching light, and then where those petals are kind of curving towards the light and that belly of that petal is catching the majority of the light. All of those are things that I'm just having in mind as I am doing this layering with this darker color. I am leaving the lighter value sections and of course the lightest light or highlights free of this layering. All right, in just a bit, I'm going to be bringing in the green because I'm going to be placing a little bit of this green in those sections in between the inner parts of those petals that are connecting to that central part of the flower. So here's my green, and you're going to see me go in to fill in most of these quote-unquote triangle shapes created, these negative spaces created in between these intersections of the petals closest to the central part of the flower. And this is because I didn't want to leave them just as negative spaces or empty spaces, because sunflowers have this base of the stem. I don't know what it's called, but they have lots of little green sections that are holding that petal part up. And you can see these green sections, this base of the stem, through the petals a lot of the time, especially if the sunflower doesn't have that many petals or has thinner petals or has sparse areas where the petals are not overlapping on top of each other so much. So I definitely wanted to add in a little bit of that green for that effect. All right, so here is the point at which I start having a little bit more fun with that color, because it is time to deepen and darken the darkest shadow sections that I see in that reference photo. There is plenty of very, very dark darks in the central section of the flower in that reference photo. So what I'm doing here is I'm bringing in my purple as my shadow color that I'm going to be using to push those darkest areas with. So what I'm doing is I am doing overlapping only on the darkest shadow sections that I see here. In that raised kind of ring in the central section, I am going in with a little bit more of a scribbling motion, just because I am still trying to describe that texture in that central area, in that raised ring that I was talking about before. And you can see how by me going in and creating these abstract irregular shadow shapes approximately where I see them in the photo, this really helped raise up this inner ring in the sunflower. It created those levels, that illusion of some sections being upwards or coming forward and other sections receding or going back, being lower than that. So those darker value shapes really help raise up certain sections and create a distinction between those different layers that are happening there. After doing that darkening in the central section of the flower, I also pushed some of those little green triangles in between the petals a little bit more with the purple, just jumping around and overlapping this purple on top of the green only in some of those green shapes. And right here, I am really jumping around the entire petal area and also adding in a tiny bit of this purple along some of the edges of these petals, just pushing that darkest dark kind of value a little bit more, especially where there is shadow created in between petals, where a petal is overlapping on top of another one and creating a shadow on the one underneath. That's where I'm using my purple, and I'm not using my purple in all of the petals, just in some petals here and there. And this really helps create that integration because I'm using the purple for my shadow color, so to speak, in many of these areas throughout the piece. Right here, I went back to my burnt ochre, and I am adding a little bit more scribbling in this most textured section in the central part of the sunflower. I felt there was a little bit too much white in that area. And then I switched on back to my purple and continued using this color to create my darkest shadow shapes along the stem and also in the leaves. After doing that work in the stem and the leaves, I'm also going to be darkening certain areas with my purple in the bottle. And just like with everything else, I'm just noticing the darkest shapes in that reference photo, and I'm trying to replicate them to the best of my abilities with this purple without stressing about getting that shape exactly the same as I see it in the photo, just getting it roughly in. All right, so before moving on to the next part of this process, which is going to be our second activation with water, I am going to brighten up some sections and I'm going to bring in a little bit more of my fun colors and deepen and darken certain sections a little bit more. Also, if you have highlight areas or white areas that are too big, you can make them smaller. Or if you need to work on transitions between different colors, you can also do that. Just make sure that you're picking your colors mindfully, thinking of the value that you're going to be creating with that color. The first thing that I did was I brought in my yellow once again to do a little bit of layering with that lightest, brightest color in the petals. That helped me brighten the petals up a little bit more and also integrate the colors that I've been using in the petals. And what you're seeing me do now is I am bringing in my red into certain sections of those petals. I didn't bring in red into every single petal, but I did want to use a bit of red in this upper section of this piece, because so far I've only used red at the bottom in the bottle, and I'm always looking for ways that I can repeat different colors in the different areas of my piece so that I can integrate things together a little bit more. And I also wanted to bring in these 4 different colors in this square color scheme a little bit more. So I just added a little pop of color with my red, especially in darker mid-tone sections, because this red I would consider to be a medium color, and I don't want to start covering up my lightest lights with my red. I also don't want my petals to start turning too red. Remember that the majority of that layering you want in darkest shadow areas. I am still keeping my lightest values and my highlights protected with little to no pigment on them. You can see how I have my soft graphite eraser right there on my left, and you've probably seen me go in a couple of times with the soft graphite eraser to remove some excess pigment that I've laid down accidentally. And this is a little trick, something that you can definitely do when you're using watercolor pencils. As long as that color is not activated with water, you can definitely go in with an eraser and pick some of it up. After that work I did in the petals with my yellow and my red, I did a little bit more pushing in that central section of the flower with my purple, and then I went back in with the burnt ochre to integrate the purple with the color underneath a little bit more. And after that, it was time to do a little bit more work in the stem and the leaves. So you're gonna see me go in with both my green and my purple to work on pushing those darkest values in these sections. So first I go in with my green, which is the lighter color of the two. And once I have more green laid down in mid-tone areas, I go in with my purple. And I do my layering with this purple only in darkest shadow areas. I'm still acknowledging all of these shadow shapes as abstract, irregular shapes. And I'm doing my best to stay away from heavy, blocky shapes and also distracting or stark looking lines or marks. I did start pressing down a tiny bit harder in this phase, but I'm still not burnishing my paper or anything like that. I don't want to damage the tooth of my paper. All right, moving on to phase number 4. This is going to be the second color activation process. So everything, all the tips and the overall method that I shared with you in the first activation process goes for this one as well. I am making sure to notice, pay attention to how I am pushing and pulling that pigment around my paper, trying my best to protect highlight sections. I don't want to cover them up with pigment. And I'm also making sure that I'm noticing how much pigment is getting collected in the bristles of my paintbrush so that I can remove that pigment from my paintbrush bristles whenever I need to and continue wherever I left off with a clean and only slightly damp paintbrush. I am paying attention as well to how much water I have in my paintbrush bristles because I don't need too much water at all. And I don't want to start losing control of water or dripping water all over the place. So you can see how every single time I go into my container, I remove that excess water by gently scraping the bristles of my paintbrush along the top of my container and or quickly dabbing the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel before going in. Even with my paintbrush, when I am doing that color activation in that central part of the flower, I'm doing teeny tiny scribbling motions as opposed to back and forth motions with my paintbrush. So I'm still bringing to mind the texture that I'm trying to describe and always looking for ways that I can shift and change the tool that I have in my hand, whether it's a pencil or a paintbrush, to better describe that texture subtly. You're gonna see me make my way down the sunflower, paying attention to all of the aforementioned things, making sure that I have my different value sections in mind, and I am not spending too long on any single area. As you do your activation, you're gonna see how these colors melt together. For me personally, I don't feel the need to go in and smooth everything out super perfectly because I kind of like that sketchy look, that texture created by the cold pressed paper and the pencils, and this helps me arrive at a painterly look and also a sketchy look that I love. If you don't want as much texture, you can always use hot press watercolor paper, which is the smoothest, most untextured watercolor paper that you can use, but you're almost always going to be left with some amount of texture when you use watercolor pencils. When compared to using traditional watercolor paint, even if you're working on hot press paper and even if you're constantly activating that color with water. And I would recommend not fussing too much with the pigment and trying to smooth everything out super perfectly, because you could run the risk of completely ruining your different value areas and overworking your paper. And I talk all about this in a Watercolor Pencil 101 video that is a great guide for beginners. I share tons of must-know information that you should definitely know about if you're just getting started with watercolor pencils. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that video down below in the description box so that you can go and check it out. All right, you guys, so I finished up with that second activation with water, and then it was time to allow everything to dry completely. And once everything was completely dry, it was finally time to get started with the last phase of this entire process. In this last part of the process, I am doing a few different things. Number one, I am looking to push the very darkest dark areas a little bit more. This time I'm pressing down a little bit more on my paper. Of course, because the purple is the color that I'm using to deepen and darken the darkest shadow areas, I use plenty of purple at this point. I'm also describing texture a little bit more. So right here, you're seeing me go in with my yellow and my burnt ochre in this ring in the central part of the flower with a little bit more of my scribbling, which simultaneously develops texture and continues developing value as well. After having done my work with the yellow and the burnt ochre, I am going in with the purple in this ring as well. And you can also see me use a scribbling motion with my purple. After doing my work in this petal area of the sunflower, I am going to be making my way down with this purple, using the purple to deepen and darken the shadow areas along the stem and the leaves, and also deepening some sections in the bottle. And then I'm going to finish by adding a little bit more red in some of my petals. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops. All have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!